everyone, it's Katrina, Ghosts of Ironsides. Ironsides was a wooden steamer ship designed to transport passengers and cargo on the Great Lakes. She first launched in 1864 and was one of the most luxurious ways to travel across Michigan by water. She had 44 staterooms, twinkling chandeliers, bath fixtures made of marble, and even hot running water. Back then, most homes didn't even have hot running water. But the ship was leaky. Every time she unloaded her cargo, the hold was wetter and wetter. Rumors began to circulate that the ship was not seaworthy and that it was a disaster waiting to happen. The sailors on board the ship believed that she needed a complete overhaul, but the owner was too busy making lots of money. In 1872, the ship was officially reported to be in great shape. However, on the night of September 13, 1873, a storm would prove to be Ironsides' ultimate end. The storm rolled in after midnight. Waves and winds beat upon the ship's hull and she cracked. Water rushed in, the ship's pumps couldn't keep the thing afloat, and by morning, the passengers were up to their knees in water. There was no chance of them being saved because no other ship could go out in such a violent storm. The passengers on board escaped in the 5 lifeboats. 3 of them capsized and only 2 made it to shore. Dozens of bodies were found the next day floating and bobbing in the waves. Ever since then, people swear they sometimes hear the sound of the hopeless passengers still calling out for help in the night. The Peter Iredale. The Peter Iredale was built in Maryport, England back in 1890. It was owned by a British shipping firm and had a rather short life. On September 26, 1906, the ship left Salina Cruz, Mexico on its way to Portland, Oregon. It was to pick up a cargo of wheat and then return to the United Kingdom. The ship sailed into heavy fog, reached the mouth of the Columbia River early on October 25th, and then smashed right into the breakers. The unfortunate Peter Iredale ran into the shore at Clatsop Beach and hit the beach so hard that 3 masts snapped and the ship was abandoned. In this case, none of the crew members were seriously injured. They managed to shoot rockets into the sky as a signal for help. They were quickly rescued by a different vessel, but the ship was ruined. It was completely stranded on the shore and is still there to this very day, being one of the most haunting tourist attractions in Oregon. There's not much left of the Peter Iredale now. It's been broken apart by constant waves and wind and thrashing sand for the past century. All that you can see today is the sad remnant of its hull, the ship's lonely metal bones in the wet sand. MV Lyubov Orlova. The MV Lyubov Orlova was supposed to be a luxury ship for sailing around the world. Instead, it became infested with rats and turned into a creepy ghost ship. The vessel was originally built in 1976 and was strengthened to be a tough ice cruiser that could navigate in the most frigid parts of the world's oceans, specifically for Antarctic cruises. But in 2006, the MV Lyubov Orlova ran aground in Antarctica and had to be towed back to North America. Then in 2010, the ship was seized by Canadian authorities for unpaid debts. For 2 years, the huge vessel sat at a Canadian dock until it was finally taken to have its parts sold off. As the ship was being towed from Canada to the Dominican Republic, where it was to be dismantled and sold as scrap, the line connecting the ship with the tugboat snapped, and it drifted off on its own course. As far as we know, this ship is still floating around aimlessly somewhere in the ocean. There's nobody on board except for vicious cannibal rats. There were rumors in 2014 that the ghost ship was on its way to Britain. 2 years later, residents of Scotland saw what looked to be the vessel floating just offshore. And then, finally in 2017, the ghost ship crashed into the California coast, but it didn't stay there for long. High tides brought the ship back out into the ocean, and no one has seen it, or the crew of rats aboard, since then. The Flying Dutchman. The tale of the mysterious Flying Dutchman has been around since at least the 1700s. The legend of the ship began with sailors alleging that they witnessed a ghostly vessel at a distance, a vessel which meant doom was ahead. Reports of a ghost ship being seen then went on for the next 250 years, until just recently. This is despite the bizarre fact that the Flying Dutchman may not have ever even existed. That's right. What is perhaps the most well-known ghost ship may never have sailed even one of the 7 seas. The first written accounts of the Flying Dutchman seem to circulate around the Cape of Good Hope, from sailors aboard ships traveling from Europe to Asia. The legend says that Captain Hendrik van der Decken, also known as the Dutchman, left Amsterdam for the East Indies, then loaded up his ship with silks and spices to bring back to the Netherlands. The year was 1641. As the ship was sailing past the Cape of Good Hope, a storm appeared out of nowhere. The crew begged their captain to turn back and go the other way, but he refused and sailed them straight into it. His insane decision caused the boat to sink and the crew to die. At least that's the story. Ever since 1790, people have witnessed the Flying Dutchman moving as a ghostly silhouette through distant storms, the crew still desperately trying to free themselves from damnation. The World Trade Center ship. By far one of the most haunting ghost ships ever found was the wooden boat discovered beneath the ruins of the World Trade Center in New York City. It happened back in July of 2010 during rebuilding efforts in Lower Manhattan. Construction workers couldn't believe their eyes when they found the mangled remains of a forgotten wooden ship 22 feet beneath street level in a pit. Researchers were able to age the ship based on tree rings from its timbers. They believe it was built in 1773, probably in a small shipyard in Philadelphia. Researchers say the wood was probably from white oak trees, the same wood used to build parts of the Independence Hall, the very building where the Declaration of Independence was signed. But how did a ship get underneath the World Trade Center? It's worth noting that the archaeologists also found animal bones, ceramic dishes, and a lot of very old shoes. Back in the 1700s, this whole area was nothing but a swamp. That swamp then became a landfill, which was used to build pretty much all of the Manhattan coastline. Yes, Manhattan is literally built on an island of garbage. The origin of the ship and how it ultimately ended up where it was found remains a mystery. And now for number 5. But first, it's shout-out time! Wanted to say a big thank you to Rude Valve and Zero Cheats Gaming. Thanks so much for watching and spending time with us. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe and join the Origins Explained family. The Helvetia. The Helvetia was once a proud ship with billowing sails hailing from Norway. Now nothing remains but remnants, a few pieces of her broken body sticking out of the sand at Rosylley Beach in Wales. Resembling newly discovered bones of a prehistoric monster, the shipwreck is only visible at low tide. She originally sank back in 1887 after sailing from Campbelltown in Canada back to the UK. She was loaded with about 500 tons of timber. The crew were just 5 miles from reaching home when a sudden breeze had them stranded for the night in the middle of the dark, not quite sure where the shore was. By the morning, when they could finally see, the winds had pushed them way down into the Bristol Channel. They were now 10 miles from the harbor and getting farther away. But it didn't matter for long. As the ship struck a sandbank, the crew was forced to abandon ship, and the vessel crashed and broke itself apart on the beach. The very beach it still occupies today. Ghost ship on the Black River. There is a mysterious ghost ship abandoned on a tributary of Lake Erie known locally as the Black River. It's in northern Ohio, and how the boat came to be resting in the river is unclear. Historical records show the ship was once called the Romeo and Annette in 1949 and was commanded by Captain Romeo Allard. The captain ran a ferry service between New Brunswick and the Gaspé Peninsula in Quebec. This much is known from news clippings throughout the years. What makes this a mystery is that no one seems to know how it made its way into the Black River and why it is still there, eerie and abandoned. The ship, later called the Upper Canada, was last owned by a man named Al Johnson in 1999, but how it crossed the border nobody can say. It's now not only an eyesore, but an extremely dangerous lure for explorers who want to check the abandoned ship out. It's filled with mold, rusty hunks of metal, and perhaps even the ghosts of whomever left it in the river. The Emily G. Reed. The ghost of the Emily G. Reed sometimes appears from her grave in the sand, a reminder of her tragic past. Her most recent appearance was back in 2017, when a winter storm tossed up sand and revealed what little remains of the ship. She's buried at Rockaway Beach in Oregon, and this was her 3rd sighting since the 1970s. Every now and then, the conditions are just perfect for the decaying pieces of the boat to be visible on the beach. This most recent sighting revealed 23 wooden boards of the Emily G. Reed's ribcage. Soon the entire ship will be decayed, with not a single trace of it left. But how the ghostly remains of this ship got here in the first place is quite an interesting story. The Emily G. Reed crashed into the entrance of the Nehalem River in the year 1908 because it couldn't find the light shining from the Tillamook Rock Lighthouse. The ship got a little disoriented, was about 30 miles in the wrong direction, and wrecked herself on the beach on Valentine's Day, trying to figure out where the lighthouse was. The ship was visible there on the beach for a few decades, but it had completely vanished by the 1950s. It wasn't until 1975 that she reappeared once more, reminding the locals of just how treacherous their coastline has been throughout history. When the ship wrecked, at least 7 men died after being carried out to sea. The captain and his wife survived by clinging to a piece of the wreckage until they were finally pushed up on the shore. The ghost ships of Iwo Jima. Near Iwo Jima in Japan, ghost ships from World War II recently pushed their way up from the watery grave they had been in since the 1940s and returned themselves to land. These ancient ships literally resurrected themselves from the deep and can now be seen lying on the coast of the island of Ioto. The island's name translates in English to Sulphur Island. It gets this name because of the dangerous sulfur gas vented out from the volcano beneath it. The whole island smells strongly of rotten eggs, and when the underwater volcano erupted just a few months ago, it created a small island of its own just off the coast of Ioto. The force of an earthquake here in late 2021 was so intense, creating such a dramatic change in the geology of the area, that it pushed up about a dozen lost ships onto the surface of the volcanic island, literally spitting them back out of the ocean. These aren't warships, but rather ordinary boats and barges that had been scuttled on purpose to create a breakwater for the US Navy in 1945. The US sank concrete barges and cargo vessels that were there to support the Navy, but when the war was over and the Americans were gone, they left their artificial breakwater behind. These ships weren't that deep under the water, but it's still pretty impressive that a 6.1 magnitude earthquake was able to lift them out. Now they are littered along the shores of the volcanic island, where they could stay for another 76 years. The Patriot. The disappearance of the Patriot in 1813 is one of the strangest maritime mysteries that has never been solved even today. The most notable person on board the ship was Theodosia Burr Alston, the daughter of Aaron Burr. Aaron was the vice president to Thomas Jefferson. You know, the one who shot Alexander Hamilton in a duel and killed him. Theodosia had just recently married a wealthy landowner from South Carolina and was on her way to New York on board the Patriot. But the ship never made it to New York. No one has any idea what happened to the Patriot. At the time, it was believed that the schooner had wrecked herself off Cape Hatteras. But if the schooner had wrecked, pieces of the wreckage should have started washing up on shore within the next few weeks. This never happened, so people started guessing that the ship was instead lost in the storm and at the bottom of the ocean somewhere. Yet another theory is that the Patriot was captured by pirates. Pirates were known for operating all around the Carolinas and could have easily taken the ship. But seeing as not a single piece of the Patriot has ever been recovered, for all we know, the ship is still floating out there somewhere, stuck in a never-ending fog. A horde of mummies. Authorities in Egypt recently announced the astounding discovery of an extremely well-preserved mummy from over 3,000 years ago. This mummy is fascinating for a few reasons. First of all, it's rare that a sarcophagus is opened in 2021 with a mummy still inside. Second, it was the first time that authorities opened a sarcophagus on live international TV. The mummy inside the coffin belonged to a woman who lived in what is today Luxor, sometime during the 18th dynasty. The 18th dynasty of Egypt was in the 13th century BC and was one of the most important periods. This was the dynasty that boasted some of the most famous pharaohs in history, such as Tutankhamun and Ramses II. We don't know who exactly this woman was in her life, but she was important enough to be buried in a secret tomb deep underground in the necropolis at El Asasif on the western bank of the Nile. Besides the woman's mummy in her sarcophagus, Archaeologists also uncovered the tomb of the overseer, the very man who would have overseen all mummification at the necropolis. This tomb contained all kinds of interesting artifacts, including colorful masks and over 1,000 tiny statues called ushabti. These statues were miniature figurines of servants, which were supposed to serve the deceased once they moved into the afterlife. The tomb also contained mummified remains of people from 4,000 years ago without any coffins, just slumped in a carved cave with no accompaniments. The reason for their lack of care or preparation is not yet known. Bronze Age axe. A teenager in England made the discovery of a lifetime on her third day using a metal detector to search for artifacts. Her name is Millie Hardwick, just 13 years old. She discovered a treasure hoard of items from over 3,000 years before today. One item in particular proved to be exceptionally valuable, an old Bronze Age era axe that may have been used by warriors in battle. But Millie wasn't alone in her excavating. She had gone out into the field with her father and grandfather on a Sunday morning. They had been using their metal detectors for several hours, but hadn't had much luck. They took a lunch break, had some cookies and sandwiches, and then attempted a different area of the field. After about 20 minutes, Millie came across the axe, and from there, things really spiraled. All three of the amateur archaeologists were digging out axe heads, ingots, blade fragments of bronze, and all kinds of amazing things. By the end of the day, they had uncovered at least 65 items from the Bronze Age. For those who don't know, the Bronze Age lasted in Britain from between 2300 BC to 800 BC. Some people refer to this as prehistoric England, the time before there were any written records. To put this into perspective, Stonehenge was built 700 years before the Bronze Age during the Copper Age. The Copper Age was the period of transition between the Age of Stone and the time of Bronze. What do you think about metal detecting with your family? I've never done it, but it seems really fun. Ancient cities. Archaeologists have been making some absolutely fascinating discoveries recently in Iraq. Excavation missions all across the country are putting together a puzzle of ancient Iraq unlike anything seen before. A British museum excavation recently found a mosque built entirely of mud that dates back to the Umayyad period, 1400 years ago. Not only that, the lost temple of King Gudea was found, the most famous Sumerian king that ruled during the Lagash dynasty. This guy ruled all of southern Mesopotamia between 2124 and 2144 BC, with one of his greatest works being the Temple of Ningirsu at Lagash in honor of his people's patron god. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. In addition to these incredible discoveries, a French mission excavating near the city of Larsa found the palace of King Sin-Ednam from 1850 to 1844 BC. King Sin-Ednam ruled back when Iraq was ancient Babylonia. The temple was found to contain 10 rooms and a heap of administrative complexes that the king would have ruled from. But by far one of the greatest archaeological achievements in Iraq of the last year was when a British mission helped to restore the oldest bridge in the entire world. It's located in the city of Girsu and dates back 4,000 years. Iraq truly has been busy revealing its incredible archaeological marvels. Aside from all the previously mentioned, there was the British and German team that discovered the city of Charax, built by Alexander the Great himself. They didn't excavate it, but they found it using radar surveys. According to the Director of Antiquities and Heritage in Basra, Charax is the biggest city that was ever built by Alexander. All in all, pretty amazing. Lost Hellenistic fortress. Archaeologists in Israel have unveiled a historic fortress built by Hellenistic powers and then destroyed by a force of Jewish rebels in 112 BC. Archaeologists are saying that the Hasmonean ruler, John Hyrcanus I, razed the fortified structure as he conquered Idumea. Even more, the discovery of this destroyed fortress could very well prove the origin of the Jewish celebration of Hanukkah. In Jewish lore, the tradition of Hanukkah dates back to the Maccabean revolt, which went down from between 167 to 160 BC. Jewish rebels recaptured the Temple of Jerusalem, defeating the Hellenistic forces. They then lit an oil lamp inside the temple that was supposed to have only had enough oil to last for a day, but instead lasted for 8. This newly discovered fortress was actually burned to the ground by the nephew of the rebel leader Judah Maccabee. Archaeologists found charred wooden beams, rusted weapons, and coins from what was once a heavily manned fort. When it was still standing, the stone walls of the structure would have measured over 10 feet thick. And while it doesn't technically prove that the story of Hanukkah is real, it does offer tangible evidence that something like it did happen. The fortress proves that the Hellenistic army did indeed have a line of fortifications, and that the Jewish revolt succeeded in burning that line to the ground. Giant Atlas statue. A huge statue of Atlas, buried for centuries, has been discovered in Sicily. The statue measures 24 feet tall. It was built during the 5th century BC to stand guard at the entrance of the Temple of Zeus. Now, for those of you who aren't up to date on your Greek mythology, Atlas was a titan punished by Zeus to bear the entire weight of the sky on his shoulders. For this reason, it's no surprise that the statue is so big. But according to archaeologists, it was only one of almost 40 that stood around the ancient building. None of them are standing today, and this one, which is in surprisingly good condition, was buried with the ruins of the temple for thousands of years. The temple was actually so huge that archaeologists don't think it was ever fully completed. If you're curious as to why a temple dedicated to Zeus was found in Sicily, it's because the ancient Greeks had population centers all across the region. It's actually located in Sicily's Valley of the Temples. It was part of the ancient city of Akragas, founded over 2,600 years ago. Last fugitive of Mount Vesuvius. Archaeologists recently completed the first excavation of the Roman town of Herculaneum since the 1980s. During the excavation, they discovered the skeleton and the personal belongings of someone they're calling the last fugitive. This person died when Mount Vesuvius erupted in the year 79 AD. He was found on the beach near the town, with his skeletal remains blackened and his bones cracked from heat-induced fractures. He was holding a cloth shoulder bag under his left arm, which scientists were able to analyze. It contained several different objects, including something made of metal, some pieces of cloth, and traces of gold. This is the definition of an ancient mystery. Archaeologists have been working backward to try and figure out what exactly happened to this guy. The evidence suggests that he was at the seashore when the volcano erupted, or he had been blasted there from the force of the eruption. The incredible temperature from the eruption caused his tissue to instantly vaporize. Then his skeleton was trapped in a mass of ash and debris. They've called him the last fugitive because he appears to have been fleeing the rioting volcano with his most precious belongings tucked under his arm when the explosion turned him into an instant mummy. And on that note, it's time for a shout out! Big thank you to Zoe Scuro and Harold Finberg. Thanks so much for watching and hope you're feeling better. If you are new here, welcome, and be sure to hit that subscribe button before you go. We've got lots more videos coming up. A Peruvian mummy. Archaeologists working in Peru have discovered yet another exceptionally well-preserved mummy. This time the mummy is a little terrifying. It seems to have been in distress at the time it died. It was discovered bound with ropes, its hands covering its face, and its mouth twisted in a final expression of pain. They found the mummy inside an underground structure at the bottom of a staircase. As far as the experts can gather, the mummy was killed about 800 years ago by people from a pre-Inca culture living in Cajamarquilla. When I say the mummy was bound in rope, it was literally bound completely in rope. It was like somebody caught the person in a giant net. The individual was also in the fetal position, as if they died curled over themselves and covering their face. But researchers believe the position and the rope was possibly part of a funeral custom practiced by whoever lived here. The researchers also found marine mollusks outside the tomb, suggesting there was some kind of event or activity after the body was put inside. And then later, the descendants of the mummified individual or other members of the culture kept coming back and putting food offerings like mollusks outside the tomb's entrance. So what at first glance looks terrifying might have been quite natural. 1853 slave tag. Archaeology magazine has named the discovery of a slave tag at the College of Charleston one of the top 10 finds of 2021. The tag, which comes from 1853, was discovered by faculty and students at the college, literally on the college grounds. But this is one discovery with a seriously dark shadow over it. Tags like these were used during the 18th century up until 1865 as a kind of permit showing that the enslaved person wearing the tag was registered by the slaveholder with the city. The tags were given to the slaves when they were loaned to somebody else as proof of original ownership. This was one of the darkest times in the history of America, making the discovery a little tricky to talk about. Marley Brown, an editor with Archaeology magazine, said that they included the discovery in their top 10 because it's a reminder of an individual who may have otherwise been lost to time and to the brutal dehumanizing system that was enslavement. We may not know who wore the tag, but at least by finding and preserving the history, we can keep this mysterious individual's memory alive. Archaeologists and historians can also help educate the public on the terrors that afflicted America for hundreds of years. Roman villa beneath a farmer's field. In England, archaeologists unearthed the first Roman mosaic of its kind in the United Kingdom. They discovered the mosaic, part of a Roman villa complex, beneath a farmer's field in Rutland. The mosaic is the first of its kind in the UK to show scenes from the famous epic poem The Iliad, written by Homer. It's also one of only a handful of such mosaics that have been found across mainland Europe. Archaeologists are saying it is now the most remarkable Roman piece of ancient artwork that's been found in Britain. It shows the part of the poem involving the Greek hero Achilles, the guy you might remember from the movie Troy, played by Brad Pitt. The mosaic shows Achilles and his final battle with Hector at the very end of the Trojan War. Almost as remarkable as the mosaic itself is the fact that it was discovered by accident by the son of the landowner. He got in touch with archaeologists from the University of Leicester, and they went out to his field to excavate the villa and see what else they could find. This incredible discovery may lead to more. So far, they believe the villa was probably occupied by a very wealthy person in the latter part of the Roman era. This individual had probably been a fan of classical literature to have such a scene made part of his home. A rare silver coin. Lil Krutokop, an 11-year-old girl, was taking part in the Temple Mount sifting project in Israel when she came across an unusual object. She and her family were sifting through discarded debris taken away from one of the holiest places in all of Jerusalem when the girl spotted the shiny object. It turned out to be an extremely rare coin from when Rome occupied Judea over 2,000 years ago. The little girl handed the coin over to professionals with the Israel Antiquities Authority. They cleaned the coin up and did a bit of research, discovering that the silver coin had probably come from the silver reserves that were kept at the Second Temple on the Temple Mount, before it was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70 AD. The coin had probably been minted by one of the priests at the temple, as it was inscribed with Hebrew letters that read, "Second Year." This reference was probably to the second year of the Jewish revolt in either 67 or 68 AD, when the Jews were fighting back against their Roman oppressors. The revolt wasn't a big success. It was the first of 3 major rebellions in which the Jewish people tried desperately to get rid of the Romans and to have their own unified Judea. But still, the coin is an amazing glimpse into the turbulent past of what is today Israel. The German Bog Bodies. Archaeologists have found dozens of bog bodies throughout Europe, but one of the highest concentration comes from Germany, specifically from Bavaria. In 1957, the creepy remains of a woman from the Iron Age were discovered near the small town of Pitting, along with 12 other bog bodies. At first glance, it almost looks like a fat guy with boots. This woman was interesting for one particular reason. She was discovered buried in a preserved wooden coffin. Because of the bog, her remains and the coffin itself remained in almost perfect condition for over 1,000 years. Bog bodies aren't typically found in coffins, but simply discarded in what was once an ancient swamp. We don't know who this woman was or why she was buried here, but she remains quite unique in the world of European mummies. She's not the only amazing bog body ever found either. A severed head was discovered wrapped in deerskin at a bog in Schleswig, Germany. 2 more bodies were discovered here as well in 1952, while a worker was extracting peat to sell for fuel. Both of them died around the 1st century AD, either from malnutrition or illness. They were blindfolded and then dumped in the swamp. Then there's the Dammendorf man, the victim of a sacrifice sometime around 300 BC, who was also found mummified in the bog. He was found almost entirely intact, including his skin and nails, as well as his leather shoes. Toddlers in the trees. The analysis of an extremely rare fossil, that of a person from 3.3 million years ago, has revealed something extraordinary. For the first time ever, scientists have discovered how toddlers born to our earliest ancestors avoided predators. You may have wondered about it yourself before, how human babies ever made it this far through evolution. They don't have claws, they're basically useless for the first 10 years of life, and there is no way a human baby is going to fight off something like a bear or even a particularly angry badger. But here's the thing. We evolved from primates and came down from the trees and slowly began to walk instead of swinging from branch to branch. Scientists have been struggling to find out how much time our ancestors spent in the trees and how long it took us to walk upright. The analysis of the female toddler skeleton from nearly 3.5 million years ago has now confirmed that the child did indeed walk on 2 legs, though not very well. Dr. Jeremy De Silva says the foot bones of the fossils show that the female spent a lot of time off the ground. Jeremy believes that when it came to hiding from predators, toddlers were extremely good at scrambling away, climbing up a tree, and then hiding in the branches like a monkey. Furthermore, the evidence shows that adults developed the ability to walk, but infants spent more time in trees. This is how human toddlers were able to survive, coming down from the branches only when they grew to be adults and could really defend themselves on the ground. The Perfect Shipwreck. Off the coast of East Kent in England, there is a sandbank called the Goodwin Sands that goes on for about 10 miles. The area is made up of sand over 82 feet deep. It's a picturesque thing to look at from the shore, but quite deadly to encounter from the sea. Maritime archaeologist Dan Pascoe says there are about 2,000 shipwrecks scattered across the Goodwins that experts know about, with another potential 1,500 that they don't know about. Throughout the ages, roughly 50,000 sailors have lost their lives here. During the Great Storm of 1703, 1,200 sailors were lost in just one night, with 130 ships being destroyed as they were blown hundreds of miles off course. One of these ships was the Stirling Castle, commissioned in 1674. During the Great Storm, she was blown over by the wind, broken by the waves, and sank to the bottom of the sea. She was discovered in 1979 by recreational divers in perfect condition. She was found in such amazing shape that you could literally walk down its steps, if it wasn't underwater. But sadly, bringing an ancient ship out from the darkness of the ocean was pretty much impossible back in the 1970s. When underwater archaeologists went down to take a look at the Stirling Castle, they found her no longer in perfect condition, but in pieces. The ship is now about 45 feet deep and broken apart on the sands, but just 4 decades ago, she looked as though she was trapped in a glass bottle, stuck in time and perfectly preserved. Tombs of Mystery. Archaeologists in Cyprus, part of the Soderbergh expedition, made a shocking discovery in 2018 at the Bronze Age city of Hala Sultan Tekke. They found a pair of ancient tombs filled with underground chambers and bursting with human skeletons. Some of these bones were over 3,000 years old and have been sitting in the salty soil, slowly decaying. Archaeologists also found gold jewelry, ceramics, and gemstones dating back throughout the ages, all the way to the era of the Egyptian queen Nefertiti. At least 155 skeletons were found between the 2 tombs, and about 500 artifacts. But what's amazing is that all this stuff was found in layers, suggesting the tombs were used over the centuries. The oldest layer appears to be from the 18th dynasty of Egypt, with more recent layers being from classical Greece, around the year 1300 BC. Nobody is exactly sure what was going on at this ancient site, as the discoveries are simply all over the board. A seal from the Babylonian Empire was found here from 1800 BC, meaning it must have traveled almost 1,000 miles to be buried in Cyprus. The city of Hala Sultan Tekke could have been an ancient trading center. It would explain all of the strange artifacts from the different corners of the known globe, even scarabs from Egypt. Archaeologists also say it could have been a cemetery preserved for city royalty, used consistently for roughly 1,000 years. The skeleton at Herculaneum. An extremely unique skeleton has been discovered at the site of the Vesuvius eruption in the ancient Roman city of Herculaneum. Archaeologists found the remains of a partially mutilated man who had his skin literally scorched off in the year 79 when Mount Vesuvius erupted. That would be the same eruption that destroyed the city of Pompeii and left its residents solidified in bricks of hard ash, looking as if they'd all gazed straight into the face of Medusa. This individual was between the age of 40 and 45 when he was killed, just steps away from the sea as he had likely been trying to run away from the eruption. Nobody knows exactly what this guy was doing, but it almost looked like he was trying to seek shelter in the water itself. And if you think about it, it does kind of make sense. If a great big volcano is spewing fire out of its mouth, trying to hide in the water or maybe even trying to swim out into the sea would seem like a logical option. But while this may sound kind of exciting, it definitely wasn't. According to Francesco Cirano, the director of the Herculaneum Archaeological Park, this man's last moments were absolutely terrible. He was discovered surrounded by carbonized wood, suggesting a roof beam may have crushed his skull in his final moments of life. Plus, a pyroclastic surge swept over him, with temperatures of between 400 and 700 degrees Fahrenheit. It was so hot, sweeping towards the sea at over 60 miles per hour, that it turned his bones bright red. His skin melted instantly, and his blood baked against his bones. Dying in a volcanic eruption is a pretty harsh way to go. And on that note, it's time for a shout out. Want to say a big thank you to Alan Godden and Trent Sims. Thanks so much for joining us and watching Origins Explained. If you are new here, welcome, and be sure to subscribe for more videos about amazing discoveries. Nonbinary Warrior. The ancient remains of a person who died over 1,000 years ago in Finland have been turning the world of anthropology upside down. Experts believe this individual may have been an Iron Age leader and non-binary. The individual was discovered at a grave in southern Finland back in 1968 during construction. Archaeologists found brooches, fragments of clothing, and other artifacts that suggested the dead person was a female. But oddly enough, the grave also had a sword positioned over the person's left side, something typically reserved for men. The experts had two contradicting pieces of evidence and couldn't tell if they were dealing with a man or a woman. The only thing that was clear was that the person had been a highly respected member of the community. The lead author of the study, Ulla Moilanen, said they were laid over a soft feather blanket and then drowned in valuables. This kind of thing was only done for the top members of society. A recent DNA analysis using the newest technology has unveiled that this person had Klinefelter syndrome, which means they were born a male with an extra X chromosome. Instead of having an X and a Y chromosome, they had XXY chromosomes. Experts are now saying this could have caused the person to identify as outside the traditional gender roles for ancient Finland. Whatever the case, it didn't seem to have any adverse effect on their status in the community. They were still a respected person buried in the fashion of a chieftain or a great warrior. Ancient cave art. In 1940, a group of teenagers stumbled upon one of the most impressive examples of ancient cave art anywhere on Earth. The boys were walking through the woods near the French town of Montignac when their dog suddenly vanished. A quick search for the animal revealed that it had fallen into a hole. So the boys scaled 45 feet down into the darkness to look for their dog. All they had to illuminate their way were paraffin lamps. Amazingly, the hole led to a cave, and the boys could see by lamplight that the walls and ceiling were painted in brightly colored images of unknown animals. These animals included bison, aurochs, and prehistoric lions. One of the boys was quoted as saying it looked like the animals were dancing in the flickering of their lamps. We know this place today as the Lascaux Caves, what archaeologists call a decorated cave. These types of caves have been found everywhere except Antarctica, with at least 350 of them in Europe. Even though massive distance separates all the caves, they all seem to show very similar artwork: handprints, extinct animals, and abstract designs. We don't know why ancient people all across the globe were obsessed with painting things on cave walls, but they all seem to do it. The Lascaux Caves, now closed to the public so they don't ruin the paintings, just happens to be one of the most dramatic and most exciting. The paintings here were made around 15,000 BC, back when Ice Age animals still roamed the planet. What would you do if you discovered something like this? Let me know in the comments below. The Hassan Lu Lovers. Archaeologists discovered the remains of a couple inside a burned village from 2,800 years ago. The discovery was made by researchers with the University of Pennsylvania, excavating an ancient city called Tepe Hassan Lu in the northwest of Iran. Normally, a couple of skeletons wouldn't be a big deal, but this pair was found preserved in a mud brick bin meant for storing grain. The skeletons were not only buried together, but appeared to have been kissing at the exact moment of their death, locked in the most heartwarming embrace ever found. They have been dubbed the Hassan Lu Lovers. Archaeologists say the city of Tepe Hassan Lu was destroyed by an invading army in the year 800 BC. Whoever invaded this place killed everyone, stole everything, and burned the city to the ground. Hundreds of other skeletons have been found preserved beneath the streets and dug out of the foundations of ancient houses. Most appear to have been killed where they stood or massacred inside their own homes. Archaeologists believe the Hassan Lu Lovers were hiding from the invaders inside the grain bin when they died, though not at the hands of the attackers. Instead, they may have died from smoke inhalation. Because the entire city was aflame, it would have been easy for them to perish from asphyxiation, trapped inside the grain bin as they literally ran out of breath. Ancient fishing. 12,000 years ago, ancient humans were using fishing tools just as sophisticated as the tools fishermen use today. A team of researchers led by archaeologist Antonella Pedergnana studied a small collection of early fishing technologies discovered in the Hula Valley of northern Israel. Researchers found grooved stones that they think were used as weights, as well as hooks similar in size and shape to what we use nowadays. Some of the fishing hooks even have barbs to stop the fish from escaping. Researchers say these refined methods of fishing came about due to a dramatic shift in the history of humanity. 12,000 years ago was right around the time when humans ceased being nomadic and settled down. People began to practice agriculture and live in villages, and fishing was a huge part of this. A person could easily fish at the lakeshore by their village without having to roam for miles trying to hunt deer. This sudden change resulted in a massive increase of fish in the human diet, as well as innovations so profound that we still use them today. Researchers say each fishing hook that they found was different in size and style, suggesting the ancient people who lived here had significant knowledge of fish behavior. They were skilled fishermen who fashioned fishing rods, used bait, and probably caught more fish than your average angler in the 21st century. An ancient baby rattle. Archaeologists excavating near a small Polish village came across hundreds of pit tombs, with one of them containing a baby's toy rattle from 2,500 years ago. This tomb also happened to contain the remains of a cremated baby. Let me give you a bit of background on Bronze Age burials. Pit tombs were extremely common. It was basically putting cremated remains in an urn, just like you would today, and then burying a bunch of them together in one big hole. Some of these holes have been found with over 40 urns inside of them. It was also traditional to give offerings to the gods when people were buried during this time in Europe. Many of these pits have been found with clay gifts, household items, and decorated bowls. The pit discovered with the cremated remains of the infant also had the infant's toy rattle, which was quite advanced for being so old. Someone took the time to carve the rattle out of clay and fill it with tiny balls so that it made noise when the child shook it. In total, archaeologists here found the remains of at least 150 settlers from the Lusatian culture. These settlers came from a mysterious civilization that spread from Poland into the surrounding parts of Europe, primarily cattle and pig farmers. We know they cremated their dead and that it was probably related to their worship of the sun, but not much more is known about the Lusatian other than that. The Vampire of Perperikon. At the archaeological site of Perperikon in Bulgaria, the grave of a young man who may or may not have been a vampire was just uncovered. The young man was found buried with an iron knife stuck through his heart and his left leg cut into 3 pieces and placed neatly beside him. Head of excavations, Professor Nikolai Ovcharov, says he believes this young man was mutilated after death as part of an anti-vampire ritual. The townsfolk were trying to save themselves from a potential blood-sucking vampire rising from the grave. As for why they may have thought this guy was a vampire, the professor went on to say that he probably experienced an unnatural cause of death. This could mean anything from a mysterious disease to dying under dubious circumstances. Whatever the case, an iron knife through the heart and the dismemberment of one leg seemed to do the trick. And believe it or not, the vampire wasn't the only bizarre grave found here. Another was found with a woman and child positioned like the Virgin Mary and the baby Jesus. And yet again, the professor says this fairly common type of burial was a medieval practice to protect the townsfolk from something they didn't understand. Normally, it was the plague. Ancient burial mounds. Back in 1865, the Big Barrel Mound was excavated in East Kazakhstan. Archaeologists discovered the burial plot of a noble, buried with 17 horses. Everything was found in almost perfect condition because of the permafrost that kept all the dead bodies frozen. Then, in 1999, archaeologists revisited the site and uncovered a new burial mound, in which they discovered the body of a man, a woman, and 13 horses. This new burial proved exciting because archaeologists also found gold ornaments depicting strange mythical creatures. They found things that look kind of like elk, totally indiscernible animals, and things that may or may not have been griffins. This entire area is covered in graves. The ancient steppe people who lived here in the Altai region thousands of years ago were some of the first to bury their dead. Archaeologists even found cenotaph graves in which a person had a burial without their body. If someone died or went missing, a symbolic burial was created in which a horse would be killed and buried along with an empty stone coffin. As for who the people were, researchers believe they may have been associated with the Yuezhi people. They were probably wiped out in the 3rd century AD when the Huns rolled through the area and killed pretty much everyone. Mysterious elk bones. The bizarre discovery of ancient elk bones has been puzzling archaeologists since 1999. When a series of bones were excavated from the Lundby Bog in Denmark, archaeologists later dated the mysterious elk bones back to sometime around 9400 BC. Give or take a century, that's about 11,000 years before today. But this was based on science from 20 years ago. Specialists recently went back to take a new look at the bones and were able to date them back even further to 9873 BC. What this means is that the elk bones weren't buried in the bog over a short period. They weren't part of a single mass sacrifice or anything. Instead, they had been placed in the bog over several centuries. What makes this so mysterious is that, according to Christopher Buck Pedersen with the Museum of Southeast Denmark, there have been no settlements found that are that old in the region. People were clearly living here and continuously placing bones in the bog, yet there is no trace of any habitations from the period associated with the discovered bones. We don't know who put the bones in the bog or why, yet there are several of them, at least 6 deposits just bursting with elk bones. It almost certainly had something to do with a prehistoric ritual, but it's impossible to paint a clear picture of the site and its purpose without more evidence. The best guess scientists have now is that the Magalmosian culture was behind the elk bones. This is because archaeologists discovered an axe made from elk antler, something we know was used by the Magalmosians between the years 9000 and 6000 BC. Grave of the giant warlord. Archaeologists have discovered the grave of a giant warlord horseman from the 11th century. He was found inside an extremely elaborate grave, decorated in a death mask, adorned with the fang of a bear, and buried with heaps of arrows. All these trinkets were supposedly indications of just how strong and powerful the warlord was. Scientists say he towered over other people of the day, at least a foot taller than the average Siberian native at the time. He stood approximately at 5'11". That's actually taller than the current average for American men, meaning that by the standards of the time, this man was a giant. This man has been named Bogatyr by the Russian researchers. It translates roughly to Great Warrior. But even though this man was huge and most definitely a fearsome warrior in what is today Western Siberia, there is still a great deal that archaeologists can't figure out about him. For example, his death mask was found laced with metal fish figurines. Archaeologists and other researchers are unsure about what they mean, but suggest they could have had religious significance. There was also a decorated bronze mirror placed on his chest that the experts are a bit confused by. They think it may have been a tool designed for the dead man to communicate with the gods once he was buried. And then, of course, there was the small hoard of arrows that he was supposed to use for any necessary hunting in the afterlife. Bogotyr was probably around 40 years old when he died. The cause of death isn't certain, but it may have had something to do with the fact that his left arm was severed and buried beside his broken shoulder. He almost definitely died in battle. Stone Age rituals. In Sweden, on the uninhabited island of Blajungfrun, an ancient ritual center has been discovered in a series of caves. The ritualistic activities that went on here date back up to 9,000 years ago. Even today, the island has a deep association with witchcraft, curses, and supernatural forces. The archaeologists behind the discovery say that there was extensive human activity on the island during the Stone Age. They found a fireplace underneath a huge hole that had been hammered into the wall of one of the caves. This could have been a stage that was partially covered. That way spectators could stand at the top and peer down the cavern entrance, seeing the flames and hearing the great hammering at the wall. And here's where things get really spooky. Researchers at the site discovered an altar where offerings may have been made to unknown deities. But because this was 9,000 years ago, whatever details of the types of ceremonies and rituals that were enacted in this ancient site that reeks of magic is still a total mystery. Ancient seal bones have been discovered underneath the rock, quartz has been found for making tools, but not much else. No human remains have been discovered to suggest sacrifice. All we know is that something creepy was going on here, and all these years later, not a single soul lives on the island. Perhaps there is a reason for people to shy away from the area. An Aztec dog skull. Excavations at a subway extension in Mexico City turned up one of the more unusual Aztec offerings ever found. Archaeologists found the skull of a dog with holes in it. The holes indicate that it was at one time displayed on a ritual skull rack called zompantli. These racks are exactly what you're picturing in your mind. Imagine a rack for hats or coats, except it's filled with human skulls. This type of decor was normally reserved for the victims of human sacrifices, but the presence of the dog skull shows that our canine friends may have also been the unfortunate victims of having their heads mounted. At the same time, excavators found the skull of a woman and the skulls from two men with similar perforations. These skulls were probably also mounted on a public display rack. But it's really the dog that has the attention of archaeologists because something like it has just never been found before. The skull dates back to somewhere between 1350 and 1521. This was the prime killing season for the Aztecs. When they captured warriors from rival groups, they almost always sacrificed a few of them as offerings to their gods. And when victims were offered up as food for the gods, their heads went on racks. Archaeologist Maria de Jesus Sanchez says horse skulls have been found on racks before, but definitely never dogs. And now for number 4. But first, I want to give a big shout out to Ashley's Interest and JM. Thanks so much for supporting Origins Explained. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe for more scary archaeological discoveries. Semi-digested food. What I'm about to tell you is kind of disgusting, so you better prepare yourself. New research has proven that our Neanderthal ancestors feasted on the semi-digested food that they discovered inside the stomachs of animals they hunted. As gross as that might sound, the stomach contents of animals are in fact totally edible. You could go hunt a deer right now and eat whatever it hasn't digested at the time of its death. Neanderthals figured this out and used it to their advantage to get as much food and nutrition from their kills as they possibly could. The discovery came in part by analyzing the plaque found on Neanderthal teeth. Researchers found a bizarre substance known as chyme. The only way to get chyme is to take it from the stomach of a dead animal. Partially digested food mixed with stomach acid creates a disgusting green goop called chyme. Since it was found on Neanderthal teeth, they were very clearly consuming the undigested food of their prey, leading to the green goop being found in abundance. But this gross discovery was actually part of a larger study on the Neanderthal diet. Researchers found that our ancestors ate pretty much anything they could. Some Neanderthals even feasted on chamomile herbs, which taste terrible and have absolutely no nutritional value. Some researchers believe they ate chamomile to self-medicate. Maybe they made tea. Then again, maybe not. Neanderthals may not have been that smart. They may have actually been eating half-digested chamomile by accident while slurping from animal guts. Would you ever eat half-digested food from an animal's stomach to survive? Let me know in the comments below. Maya altars and snake kings. In the jungles of northern Guatemala, archaeologists have discovered a carved stone altar in the ancient city of La Corona. The altar dates back 1,500 years to the days of the Maya and is the oldest relic of its kind at La Corona site. It comes from the classic Maya period, between 250 and 900 AD. Researchers with the National Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology in Guatemala City did an analysis of carvings on the altar. They seem to show the origin of the Canul dynasty, which went on to rule the Maya lowlands for about 200 years. The altar shows a previously unknown king named Chak-Tuk-I-Chak. In the carving, he's seen carrying a double-headed serpent, which makes perfect sense. After all, the rulers of the Canul dynasty were known as the Snake Kings. The Snake Kings were feared throughout all of the Maya world. In the year 562, the capital of the Maya Empire, Tikal, fell under the forces of the Canul dynasty. But even though we have found traces of these powerful and mysterious people throughout most of the old Maya world, we still know very little about them. They were likely an ambitious force in the south that decided to push up and take over the entire empire, succeeding in some places, and then ultimately vanishing by the year 900. Ritual violence. In 2012, the country of Denmark revealed archaeological excavations where experts found the bones of an entire army. This army had befallen some of the worst ritualistic violence imaginable some 2,000 years ago. Many of the warriors who fell during this major battle fought near the modern Danish town of Skanderborg, and they had been absolutely mutilated. For example, one of the finds was a wooden stick shoved through the pelvic bones of 4 different fallen warriors. Archaeologists also found hundreds of crushed skulls, bones with evidence that they had been cut or bashed, and other gruesome finds. According to the researchers from Aarhus University, all of this brutality occurred about 6 months after the fallen warriors had already been lying dead on the battlefield. Here is what likely happened. Dead people were gathered together, the flesh was cleaned from their bones, and then they were brutally desecrated before being moved to the nearby lake and disposed of. It was probably some kind of religious act, but archaeologists are stumped about what the precise purpose could have been. Today, it honestly just seems like violence for the sake of violence. Killer Cave of Hades. There is a giant cave in Greece that experts say may have been the inspiration for the Greek underworld known as Hades. This cave had also once been the home of hundreds of people, before it collapsed and killed everyone inside. The cave was first discovered in 1958. It's positively gigantic, nearly 3,300 feet long, and so big that it has its own lake. Archaeologists have found copper artifacts, pieces of pottery, and tools that date back to the Stone Age, 9,000 years ago. Cave dwellers used it as a shelter and also as a cemetery. But all that came to an end 5,000 years ago when it collapsed and buried everyone alive. But just because the cave collapsed didn't mean the locals forgot about it. Researchers believe the cave continued to be used as a burial place and as a location for mysterious rituals. Entering into the collapsed cave would have felt like going into the underworld. It even had its own creepy underground river that may have been the inspiration for the river Styx. It's impossible to say for sure if the cave really was where the Greeks came up with their version of the underworld. But looking at its complex history and the Greek fascination with a subterranean land of the dead, it's definitely the #1 suspect for a real-life Hades. Would you dare enter the deadly cave of the god of the underworld? Let me know in the comments below, and thanks for watching! Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you soon for more terrifying and fascinating archaeological discoveries. Bye!